I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. The freedom to say what you wish, to publish your ideas without constraint, is one of the bedrocks of our civilization. It is what our culture was built on. You could be forgiven to think that with so much intellectual and legal support, the freedom of speech in Western society would have reached a status at which it need not be discussed any longer, but that's not the case. That it would be self-evident that the right to express your opinions in whatever way you please is non-negotiable in the modern world. Unfortunately, you could not be more wrong. Under various guises, our most fundamental liberty is being eroded. It is put in doubt by political correctness, which effectively bans certain phrases and thoughts from the public discourse. Now, we've invited two people here. Janet Albrechtsen, you know, is Australian. She has a regular column on a Wednesday. So Janet will speak first, and then we'll pass over to Ayaan. Now, Ayaan Hirsi-Ali's story is probably as familiar to many of you now as anybody else's. If you haven't read her books, go and buy them. Infidel came out several years ago, and part of the reason she's in Australia at the moment is to talk about her latest book, Nomad. So firstly, over to you, Janet. Thank you.
Freedom of speech sits right at the core of Western civilization, and we are here to defend it today. And it strikes me that every day, in so many spheres and in so many ways, free speech is not as free as it should be. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about grand issues like the clash between Islam and the West, that Ayaan will talk about further after me, or whether we're talking about more prosaic issues such as economic matters, tax reform, stimulus packages, climate change, Indigenous policies. Still, we find that there are so many constraints around free speech that we're not having the sort of open, honest discussion about the confronting issues that we need to be having if we're serious about doing what the West does best, and that is progress. So I want to talk a bit today about some of the techniques, because I think it's really important that we be attuned to the tricks and tactics that are used both in Australia in recent times, and I'll focus on those. I will also touch a bit on, the clash between Islam and the West, because if we're not attuned to them and if we don't fight against them, then I think we slowly surrender to we don't even realise that speech is not so free anymore. So let me talk a bit about those tricks. Different groups, it strikes me, have their own tricks. So that if you're a member of the so-called educated classes and you don't want open, honest debate about immigration or border control, we kind of know those tricks. They're so familiar. They use these emotionally charged epithets like racist and referring to Australia as a xenophobic community. The opponents here are not just wrong, they're evil. Their views are not meant to be heard in a civilised society. And it's still a standard trick. We saw it recently when Julia Gillard called for an open, honest discussion on immigration. Immediately she was struck with accusations that she was whipping up the racists in Australia, that she was dog whistling Pauline Hanson style. We heard, Exhibit 1 here is Julian Burnside, who's become a bit of a media tart, who said that Labor should ignore the marginal seats, those that house a redneck contingent who would love to send the boats back at gunpoint. Apart from Burnside, I always find it rather useful to check out Fairfax newspapers and the ABC to see whether this trick is still in use. And sure enough, on that morning that Julia Gillard was talking about immigration, I turned on the radio and Deb Cameron was speaking. She'd introduced to her audience two, quote, good humanitarians to talk about immigration. Now, of course, what she meant by two good humanitarians was two people that she agreed with. Two people who believe that strong border control is the sign of a cold heart and racism. And she means that if you're in fact in favour of strong borders, you're not a good humanitarian and you don't get to talk on her show. And at the end of what I thought was pretty much a nodding head session, Deb Cameron crowed, well, if there's a debate to be had, we'll have it here as well. And I guess that's what the ABC regards as a free debate, but of course we know better than that. When it comes to discussing the clash of cultures between Islam and the West, that old favourite trick is to play the victim in what Monica Ali called, best described as the marketplace of outrage, where different groups vie for victimhood status, each claiming that their feelings have been hurt more than others. And by now we all know that familiar opera of Muslim oppression used to shut down free speech on this front. Ayaan has had first-hand experience with this, so she'll speak more on this, but let me just run through quickly what strikes me as a very familiar opera, where in the first act we have something very simple. Perhaps it's a book called The Satanic Verses, or perhaps it's a silly Danish cartoon, or perhaps it's a film called Submission, or perhaps it's a silly South Park cartoon sending up the fact that Muhammad is about the only guy on the planet who's not subject to ridicule. And then the libretto comes. Muslims scream about hurt feelings. In the second act, the drama builds. Death threats are issued. Flags are burned. Fatwas are issued. Boycotts are imposed. And then there's that great aria of all accusations, Islamophobia. The third act is the most depressing, of course, because this is where the West capitulates, preferring the path of least resistance to actually standing up and defending freedom of expression. Hence, then US President George H.W. Bush declares that Salman Rushdie's book and the fatwa are equally offensive. Hence, 20 years later, newspapers across the globe refuse to publish the Danish cartoons. Hence, this year, Comedy Central, the channel that broadcasts South Park, inserts audio bleeps and large blocks of black reading censored, so that the very mention of, or image of Muhammad is blacked out to prevent more hurt feelings. And as those guys at South Park said, like, we lost. And we did. So we're certainly on the path to losing, because there are not enough people willing to fight in this battle to fight for free speech. And we're left with what I call a new norm of anticipatory surrender and self-censorship. So the BBC announces that Islam deserves different treatment to other religions. There's more rank capitulation when publishers like Random House decide not to publish a book about Muhammad and his wives just in case of violence. And even worse, the apparatus of the state is used to impose censorship on free speech. So when Channel 4 in Britain broadcasts a documentary called Undercover Mosque, which documented extremist messages coming out of mosques in Britain, the good bobbies at the West Midlands Police decided to investigate. But they didn't investigate the imams, of course, they investigated the program makers for stirring up racial hatred. In Holland, it gets worse. In Holland, 6 plain-clothed police officers, 2 uniformed policemen and 3 other state functionaries descend on a small apartment in Amsterdam, and they arrest a Danish cartoonist for his cartoons that mock Islam. As the Wall Street Journal wrote at the time, the skinny cartoonist surrendered without a struggle. At least he didn't suffer the fate of an Iranian man recently who was sentenced to death by a Pakistani judge for insulting Muhammad. No, we in the West, we're more gentle killers. We don't like blood on the street. But we are killing free speech, and we're doing it slowly. And I need only mention a few names. I think, again, Ayaan may address these, and you'll remember the rest. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. Writers Mark Steyn and Ezra Levant subjected to investigation by human rights commissions for discussing Islam. Even in Australia, the Queensland Anti-Discrimination Commission recently launched an investigation into comments by radio host Mike Smith when he called for a ban on the burqa. Now, I read the complaint that went to the Commission, and it was so obviously the ravings of an unhinged man, and yet the Commission accepted that complaint, and the radio station in Brisbane is now spending massive resources and time trying to deal with this. There are a million different ways to censor speech. And I always look out for the Orwellian use of language here. One of my favourites recently came out of Canada, of course. Canada's Queen's University in Ontario started a pilot program called Intergroup Dialogue, where students were appointed as dialogue facilitators and were given the authority to eavesdrop on private conversations on campus in case they found any offensive language, anything disrespectful towards ethnics, gays, or religious groups. Now, the university ultimately pulled the plug on that pilot program, not because they realised that it was wrong on simple grounds of free speech, but because they said the adverse reaction to it had, quote, poisoned the university atmosphere. The left-wing literaria has a neat way of closing down debate to exclude people from national discourse. It's best summed up by a German word, and I had to ring Oliver Hartwich here the other day, because even with my Danish background, I couldn't quite get my mouth around it, but I'll try. I've been practicing. The word is Torchschweigertaktik, and it means death by silence. And to make it easier, I've created a verb. To be toshed is to be subject to death by silence. Books, ideas that challenge the status quo are simply ignored. Shelley Gare writes about it in the current issue of Quadrant, and I'd recommend it to you. She talks about those who are toshed. They find their efforts are left to expire soundlessly, like a butterfly in a jar. It happened to Orwell when he wrote his 1938 classic, Homage to Catalonia, when he addressed Stalinist Russia's involvement in the Spanish Civil War. The left-wing literati didn't much like that, so they simply ignored it. And by the time Orwell died, only 1,500 copies of that great classic had been sold. That same death by silence has been used in Australia many, many times. For example, when Chris Kenny wrote a book exposing the fraud behind the Hindmarsh Island affair and the secret women's business, it was simply ignored. He barely sold a couple of hundred copies of that book. It was used against author Kate Jennings when she aimed her fire at the sisterhood, at postmodernism and at women's studies. It's been used right across the world. Let me turn just briefly now to some other techniques, more particularly in Australia. The government has its own techniques. In Australia in recent times, those with poor ideas and even worse policy have been using something best described as the bipartisanship racket to fence themselves off from criticism on a range of topics. The former Prime Minister became an especially eager master at this, using it on a whole range of issues. In early 2008, you may remember that Mr. Kevin Rudd called for bipartisanship on Indigenous policies. But it soon became clear that it wasn't bipartisanship that he wanted, it was supine obedience to his agenda. So that if you dared to disagree, you were immediately criticised for politicising an issue. There could be no disagreement, for example, with the rollback of the Northern Territory intervention. There could be no disagreement with the reintroduction of the permit system that keeps the media off Aboriginal lands to report on violence and other such atrocities. But just imagine if these kinds of calls for bipartisanship had been successful when people like Noel Pearson, John Howard, Mal Brough and the CIS's own Helen Hughes were changing what had become an entrenched orthodoxy on Indigenous affairs, calling for ideas such as an end to the poisonous cycle of welfare dependency, or demanding that English be taught in Indigenous schools as a first language, or that Indigenous people be given real jobs, or that there be an end to the domestic violence that kills so many thousands of Indigenous children every year. Now, I think the very last thing we need here is bipartisanship when it's used so blatantly to stifle dissent and vest moral authority in one voice, be it the government or those vested interests who are in favour of maintaining the status quo. But undeterred, the Rudd government used it again when it launched its $42 billion stimulus package. It screamed for bipartisanship in politics and broadly within the community. What, so we don't talk about all the rorts behind the insulation package program, or the cost blowouts in the Julia Gillard Memorial School Halls program. Or we don't talk about the mismanagement, the massive mismanagement within the Greens loans program. God knows, except for News Limited and especially The Australian, much of the media didn't, in fact, look at what was happening in those programs. Perhaps they fell for the bipartisanship tactic. I don't know, but certainly Kevin Rudd went on to use it again, both in relation to immigration and climate change. And the aim each time is the same. It's to shut down debate. It's to get opponents to rubber stamp rather than investigate policy. But hard questions were asked, you'll remember, and we know the rest. We don't know what Kevin Rudd is doing anymore, but we know that his bad policies have now been exposed. More recently, there was another trick to emerge from Canberra, and this time it came from the cloistered officers of Treasury, when Ken Henry, a Treasury boss, demanded a consensus from academic economists on major policy issues such as the ETS and the equally ill-fated mining tax. In one breath, Mr. Henry said that he supported the contest of ideas. Well, woohoo for that. But then he said there were occasions on which economists might, at least for a period, put down their weapons and join a consensus. Well, you know, that kind of stuff sends a shudder up my spine, that we can have a senior bureaucrat in Canberra drafting a policy which so threatens the economic prosperity of Australia, and he's calling for a consensus. Thankfully, Mr. Henry lost that debate too. And of course, that's the whole point of free speech. It's the single most effective mechanism of disposing of bad ideas. Without it, the West simply would not have progressed, and without it, we won't continue to progress. Ideas are not finessed through consensus or bipartisanship. Whenever I'm talking about free speech, I always find myself sort of banging on about first principles, and yet I think that's what you always need to come back to. You can't get away from the fact that free speech, for example, is not a left-right thing, as Mark Stein said. It's a free-unfree thing. You don't get to defend it just to defend ideas that you support. You have to always defend it, regardless. The other principle that we have to come back to is that free speech must include the right to offend. Because if we start prohibiting people from expressing offensive views, including those terrible emails that I get, then we just drive them underground where they fester. And they actually grow more intense, I think, rather than be subjected to the blowtorch of public debate. And if we prosecute offensive opinions, we create martyrs who become emboldened by celebrity. We just encourage that ever more ridiculous marketplace of outrage. Ideas, in the end, come from the most impertinent voices of dissent, and they come through open and honest debate. They're finessed and they grow stronger when they're tested, even against the most strident opposition. If you have a good idea, then you have nothing to be frightened of. But of course, free speech and the real value of debate depends on one other thing. It depends on people genuinely listening to one another, learning from one another rather than shouting each other down. And I remember what Larry King said recently when he retired after appearing on television for 45 years. He said, "I always knew that I would never learn anything while I was speaking. And so I guess I should stop speaking now and try to learn something." Thank you very much.
So what I'm left to do is pretty much a repetition of what you did. And in doing so, I'm going to share with you some experiences. And I'm also only going to limit myself to Islam in the West and challenges to freedom of speech presented by Islam. I'm not going to exhaust that. There are far too many, but I'm just going to use a few incidents that that affected me or I had to deal with. Before I say anything, freedom of speech, as I know it, is freedom of speech in the West. I don't know of any other civilization, any other culture where freedom of speech and the institutions that protect it were born and have been matured and have become such a fabric of democracy anywhere else in the world. Not in China, not in the Middle East, not in Africa. I don't know of anywhere else. So you do realize that it is a unique it's a unique thing. It's a unique. Freedom of speech is the right to offend within the bounds of the law. Polite conversation, good manners, you do that during weddings, during dinners, when you're socializing with one another, and your main intent in those events is not to go and offend one another. It's to observe etiquette. But in a society, in a civil society, especially in a democratic one, you sometimes have to share ideas or oppose and criticize the ideas of others and policies, knowing that those who feel opposed might be offended. That's what the freedom of opposition, the freedom of speech protects, the right to offend within the bounds of the law. And in every Western country, there are laws that limit how far you can take freedom of speech, of which I think the United States, I don't know about the case in Australia, but the United States has the First Amendment, and you could say that in all the Western countries, it's probably America that gives it the most space. Islam in the West. I came as a Muslim to the West. I lived in the Netherlands, and after the 11th of September 2001, I was asked by a think tank that I was working for to look into the question, why was it that many immigrants from Muslim countries had not assimilated into Dutch society, whereas I had done it in approximately 10 years. And the question was, given the fact that I was a Muslim and that I had come from a Muslim country and I assimilated so fast, did I have an opinion, did I have a view on why not the first generation, not the second generation, but third generation, the children of third generation immigrants, were so hostile to democracy, the rule of law, freedom of speech, anything at that particular time that the Dutch considered to be very Dutch. After doing some research, I formed the opinion based on the data that I found, on my experiences and on my observations, that if Muslim women were emancipated to the level of the other Dutch women, that assimilation process that we all wanted might take place. I found a lot of opposition on my way. Part of the opposition was ad baculum, the argument of force. If you write this again, if you say that again, I'm going to kill you. Now just think about that. If you bring Islam in connection with anything critical at all, I'm going to kill you. That's a compelling argument. My government, the government I was living under, thought at the time, that's just an emotional outrage. These statements are new, these interviews are new, this criticism of Islam is new. So the answer was not for me to stay in Holland and to continue the debate, but the answer was for me to be sent out to the United States for a period. This is in October 2002, for a period, so that passionate minds, passionate Muslim minds, could calm down. Now, did that affect only me? It didn't. The cartoonists in Denmark, the most famous incident, and that incident is famous, and I don't know if you know the intricacies of it, but there was a Danish school teacher in a place called Odense who wanted to help Danish Muslims assimilate into Danish society. And what he did was write a book about Muhammad. And the book he wrote about Muhammad, which I didn't read, is supposed to be incredibly positive about the Prophet. And it was his way of educating Danish people on Islam and what it meant. He couldn't publish the book. A newspaper, Jyllands-Posten, then commissioned, had the story. And the story that the journalists had was, in Denmark, you cannot criticize Islam. If you do so, you will be killed, intimidated. You know, the consequences are very clear. The newspaper then commissioned the national cartoonists and asked them to test the hypothesis. Is it safe to criticize Islam in Denmark? The journalists wanted to test that, commissioned 12 cartoonists to make a drawing of Muhammad and published those cartoons. And surprisingly, you could do that. In September of 2005, the cartoons were published and nothing happened. People voiced their opinions. Muslims said they were offended. The left wing were offended on behalf of the Muslims. But nothing much else happened. In February of 2006, months after the cartoons were published, and months after life and things had moved on, the world witnessed this outrage. The burning of Danish embassies, the boycotting of Danish goods, demands made by 12 representatives of 13 Muslim countries, including Turkey, that at the time was asking for access to the EU, to have the Prime Minister of Denmark punish the cartoonists and close down the newspaper. Now, maybe they can do that in Turkey. They certainly do such things in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and all the other countries that were represented. But the Danish Prime Minister simply told them, I cannot meet you if that's the question you want to ask me, because I have no right in Denmark to close newspapers. I just can't do it. And I can't punish cartoonists. Now that was a clash of civilizations. The interesting thing about the reactions to the Prime Minister's response from Muslims was obviously predictable. From autocrats who were used to silencing people, that was also predictable. From radical imams who thought that he had the power to do it and wasn't doing it meant he was offending God, that was also predictable. What was unpredictable was the reaction from Danish newspapers, Norwegian newspapers, Dutch newspapers, Dutch politicians, elected officials, other prime ministers just like him, who all scolded him for not meeting with the Prime Minister, not meeting with the ambassadors, for not in some way apologizing. Apologize for what? What would he apologize for? And what would that apology be worth? It took us straight back to the ad baculum, demonstrations against Denmark, for instance, in England. And you may have seen the banner that some of them were holding, behead anyone who insults Islam. And again, you may have thought that that is just an expression of emotion. Until, and I thought so too, in a certain way. I thought, well, these are things that happen in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, elsewhere, but it's inconceivable in Europe that a beheading will take place. It was inconceivable until Theo van Gogh, when he made the film submission with me, criticizing the treatment of women in Islam, was beheaded on an Amsterdam street. And that beheading sends out, you understand, it sends out a message, a chilling message to all critics of Islam. If you dare go down that path, you're not only going to be killed, but you're going to be killed in a gruesome way. And it was very effective. So effective that I was transported in a military airplane from the Netherlands to the United States to spend 75 days to be out of the way until things would cool down. But things wouldn't cool down because another member of parliament, who used to be a member of the Liberal Parliament, started his own party. Geert Wilders was also threatened. The way to keep him safe, according to the Dutch government, was to put him in prison. He was put in the same prison as those offenders of, and the suspects of the Lockerbie bombing were put in. The state, a democratic state, can do things to protect the freedom of speech. And the Dutch government protected my freedom of speech by providing policemen and the Secret Service to keep me alive and to allay the threats. But a state can also neglect to do what it ought to do. And in the case of Theo van Gogh, we knew that there was a threat. We knew at the time that there were plans, and we neglected to protect him. But those of us in the Netherlands, the government we elected, also made a different choice after the murder of Theo van Gogh. I was ostracized within the parliament and in the media, and you can read all of that if you pick up the Dutch newspapers after the murder in 2005 up to 2006. That led to a number of dramatic things, but the most dramatic one for me was not the taking away of my citizenship. The most dramatic thing for me was the Dutch government's decision to take away my security, to take away the policemen, to say we're no longer responsible for your protection. Again, it shows you how effective and how easily people can be silenced. For not having protection for me meant that would be committing suicide. It would be insensible to continue writing, to continue talking about what I was talking about, to continue criticizing radical Islam, to continue to say that there is a correlation between the way Muslim women are treated in the Netherlands, in the West, and their gap in assimilation, and not only theirs, but their children, including their boys. Janet talked about the other mechanisms, which I had all listed down, and I'm not going to bore you with them. But I wanted to also, point out what I have come to call taboo creation. We create taboos in Western society. A subject is simply declared, you can't talk about it, you can't discuss it, except in a positive way. And Islam is one of those subjects today in the West, even though it's becoming ever more difficult not to talk about it, but it's one of those subjects that you're allowed to discuss only in positive terms. You hear about Cordoba, you can talk about the philosophers, the mathematicians, the astronomers that lived about 900 years ago. But we can't talk about what today in our campuses, in our schools, in our neighborhoods, radical Islam is doing. If we do so, as one professor in the Netherlands did, he wrote a book on anti-Semitism in the name of Islam. That was his thesis, but he couldn't present it. That led, obviously, to a normal discussion, can it or can't it? And there were other professors who were willing to stand up for him, but most of them were not because they were worried about their careers. When I was in parliament in the Netherlands, members of parliament have a right to information. And if I wanted to get information on forced marriages and honor killings, I would go to the police. And some of the policemen would say, I will give you the data you're looking for, but promise not to publish my name, promise not to quote me on it. Now, ever since when was a policeman whose job it is to fight crime not proud of saying, I solved the crime, I have the data? No, not when it is about those subjects. Then we talked about, and you did it very well, the demonization of politicians, people who make them to stand up as candidates who want to talk about these things as racist, Islamophobic, and all the other etiquettes that you can think of. Then there's self-censorship. The South Park incident in the United States, it wasn't just that the two writers or producers of the sketch were threatened. It was a decision made by a very powerful company that can afford to protect itself in a country where the number of Muslims are really a minority and the number of individuals ready to take on Viacom and South Park are a handful. But the decision was made by Viacom not to repeat the entire sketch, but to bleep it, and after that, not to say anything about the subject. Then there is litigation. I don't know if you've ever heard the name Rachel Ehrenfeld, a writer, a citizen of America, and interested in the subject of the financing of terror. She happened to know a lot about economics and about numbers, and she happened to be interested in investigating it. And she happened to find a line between a man named Mahfouz, a Saudi billionaire, gazillionaire, and monies that he was donating to charities and what those so-called charities were doing with the monies. Now, in the United States, he couldn't do anything about it because of the First Amendment. In the UK, he took her to court for libel laws, and her publisher then pulled back the book. And it's not only Rachel Ehrenfeld that has met with this kind of silence. You see over and over again litigation to silence people with an alternative opinion, with an opinion that is supposed to be offensive. Even when the person taking you to court knows that they're going to lose the case. But you don't want, as a citizen, to invest. Okay, here is a general threat to us. I'm going to write about it. But if the cost is going to court, being called strident, and going bankrupt, then you are silenced. Another form of silencing, and I'm going to again stick to the subject of Islam in the West, is for Muslims, several Muslim organizations, to lobby the different governments. In the Netherlands, but I also see it now in the United States, government is lobbied to such a degree using words like xenophobia, racism, playing the victim card, not to write anything negative in public school textbooks, or not to teach in a fair way about Islam and the West and the threat it poses to young people. So you send your kids to university, they take political science or history, they're living in a world where there is a geopolitical threat and a geopolitical confrontation between Islam and the West, and they learn that Westerners were imperialists, they learn that Westerners enslaved people, colonization, etc., etc. But Islam was always fair, great, and all kinds of positive etiquettes to that. Does that fall under the heading of censorship or self-censorship? For me, it falls under the heading of suicide, but great. It's not just that. It's also the way the police are instructed to deal with suspects from minority groups, and not just the indigenous people, but especially minority groups who are organized and in reality are not a minority. Representatives of radical Islam, when they are caught as terror suspects, play the cards of race, ethnic profiling, etc. And these things are bad, and I'm not arguing for ethnic profiling. I'm not arguing for discrimination, but for policemen and prosecutors to do their job, they have to have the freedom to be able to follow a lead to an end that is a good outcome for society. I'm going to conclude by saying we now live in a world that has become more dangerous, and part of that danger is justified in the name of Islam. That in the West, it is almost impossible to discuss these subjects. We have an artificial image of Islam. We have an ever-increasing angry electorate. All those people whose representatives are silenced, whose opinions are silenced. Again, I'm referring to the Netherlands as an example. What you see is, like Janet said, a fermenting of resentment. And that resentment, because it's been over decades, has reached a level of extreme confrontation where the population is no longer willing or is no longer patient enough to see that process of assimilation, which is a long-term process, to see that process through. You hear over and over again, kick them out of the country, deport them, nuke them. You hear these extreme opinions because the normal exchange of opinion in a marketplace of ideas about what to do about a major social problem was silenced systematically. The sense of victimhood, the sense of persecution mania persecution mania within the Muslim population is strengthened. So you have a relative minority that over time will increase and become a significant minority, if not a majority. I'm talking about over time. And the receiving population that have now come to stand in front of one another, confront one another. One group feels persecuted and they feel that they need to fight back using violence, and the other group feel that their countries and their societies have been invaded, have been raped, and that they need to stand up for them. And that means that is a recipe for violence. And the leadership looks on and continues to talk in self-censored ways. The latest look at the United States, and everything that starts there, good or bad, somehow trickles down to Europe, is we no longer talk about Islamic radicalism. We're not allowed to talk about Islamic violence or even jihad. We are now fighting violent extremism. That is not a victory for the left. It's not a victory for the right. It's not a victory for those Muslim men and women who have fled countries ruled under Sharia or various forms of autocracy, who are seeking a better life. It is not a victory for the voters who have been patient and who have tried to hold on to their values. It is a victory for tyranny. It is a victory for radical Islam, because radical Islam has succeeded in using the vocabulary of freedom and the institutions of freedom to destroy freedom. Thank you.